Hello and welcome to today's event, ChatGPT and large language models separating fact from fiction in localization. My name is Laszlo Varga and I'm a senior researcher at Nimdzi Insight, and I'm joined today by my colleague Jourik Ciesielski for today's event. Together, we have been leading some very interesting research around ChatGPT and the AI technologies and have organized multiple workshops and interviews and demos with our clients. And of course, if you're interested in participating in the ongoing research or just want to find out more about our customized workshops or anything else we discuss in today's event, please reach out to us at info@nimdzi.com to start the conversation. And of course, Jourik and myself would love to connect here with you on LinkedIn and start the conversation. Foundational technologies such as transformer models and specifically large language models have made significant strides in natural language processing and machine learning. But how do they compare to traditional machine translation? Today, we will examine the differences between LLMs and machine translation and how these technologies can complement each other in real-life applications. Drawing from Nimdzi Insight's research, this event will also explore practical use cases of ChatGPT in the language services industry, examining how this technology is being utilized by organizations to solve real-world problems. Additionally, we will address the challenges that come with implementing large language models and what the future of these technologies may hold for us. This event is part of a larger event series we are hosting here at Nimdzi Insights, where we talk to industry leaders about the latest research and trends in global business and localization. We have a number of events already on the calendar, and we are hosting this one as a live event on LinkedIn. So if you are joining us live, then we encourage you to engage directly with us in the comments. We'll try to respond to your questions and insights either during the live stream or at the end of the discussion. If you missed the live stream and are watching the recording, then you can still reach out to us at info@nimdzi.com. Today's conversation between myself and Jourik will feature research and insights available to Nimdzi partners at nimdzi.com, including all these amazing articles and research results. Some highlights would be the prompt engineering starter guide, the language AI alphabet that attempts to bring a common language and understanding of these underlying tools, as well as our flagship almost 6 months of ChatGPT in the language services industry, a compilation of the research results over the past 6 months. All of which you can also, of course, access via our brand new Nimdzi Technology Hub that you can find on our website. Today, we plan on drawing on the last 6 months of research around large language models to have a discussion that can help clarify for our industry what we need to know and what is it we need to do to prepare for the future, which is certain to be turbulent. We have structured our talk into 4 sections. We'll talk a little bit about how this all came about, the timeline of innovation. We'll talk about how large language models compare, compete, or complete machine translation, as well as specific other use cases of these models. And we'll certainly discuss major challenges as well as a future outlook. So let's dive right in by looking at the timeline of innovation that led us to where we are today. And as probably most of you know, AI has been around in the language industry for quite a while and longer than most care to remember. Very specifically, a point of inflection would be Google machine translation when it converted into neural machine translation back in 2016. And then came this. 1 year later, Google released their research paper, Attention is All You Need. And indeed, just last year in November, ChatGPT brought that to everyone's attention. Attention All You Need is basically the founding paper that established the transformer models. And as you can see, most of the people who worked on the paper and the research already disseminated their knowledge into various actors in the AI industry. And with that fantastic achievement, we also wanted to bring some insights as to how the foundational technologies actually got developed since 2017, starting with Google. And Google released Attention is All You Need, Transformers, and also a large language model called BERT, which is kind of in the background, but actually it powers most of search that is being done by Google with all the other AI ecosystem underneath and next to it. And in 2020, 2 years later, GPT-3 was released by OpenAI after GPT-1 and 2, which kind of went under the rug. And even GPT-3, which, yeah, there were some experiments, there were some prototypes with the model, but certainly there was no hype, and it still went behind the curtains. And then the hype started. Sometime in 2022, November 30th, if I remember correctly, ChatGPT was released by OpenAI with massive public hype around it. It became the staple conversation at every dinner table and every business discussion. Later in February, since Microsoft has vested interest in OpenAI's success, they introduced GPT-4 into Microsoft Bing and actually connected large language models to the internet. And GPT-4 specifically was released just a month later, and from here on, really things speed up. There are massive improvements, of course, in quality, in output modes, in context, as well as a multimodality also added to the large language model. And then very quickly, OpenAI also released plugins, and the genie got out of the bottle. With those plugins, essentially almost everybody can connect large language models to the internet for various purposes. And Microsoft and Google by now also caught up with their own products, bringing GPT-4 into Microsoft's 365 as a co-pilot. And of course, Google just now released Palm 2, their latest and greatest state-of-the-art business large language model, and Google Bard and integrations into Google Workspace wherever it's made available currently. And there would be, if we were to list every single important piece in the development and the innovation of large language models, that list would be so long we wouldn't be able to read the facts on the screen. But important to mention that it's not just Microsoft and OpenAI as well as Google who are making big progress, but essentially there are other actors as well as a huge open source community who are developing models to certain degrees. That said, I would like to hand over for the more technical details about these foundational technologies to my colleague Jourik. Please take it on.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. Yeah, first things first, why do we have to talk about foundational technologies and why can't we jump directly to ChatGPT? The reason is that a lot of people talk about ChatGPT and GPT-3 and GPT-4 and large language models without knowing exactly what it is or what it does, right? So it makes sense to take a step back and to start from the very beginning, and the beginning in this case is foundational technology. So here goes the definition: the underlying infrastructure and systems that support and enable other technologies to function and evolve, right? What you need to know, foundational technologies do not have direct use cases. They're not a product, they're not a feature, it's not something that you can package and sell, but it is core to the development and the deployment of more complex technologies. It is designed to provide a stable and reliable platform for many of the AI-driven features that we're currently seeing in the language services landscape. Now we can jump to the next slide. Definitions are a little bit fuzzy, I do know that, and I have a couple of examples, and the nice thing about these examples is that they apply to machine translation, which makes it a little bit easier to explain. So the first example of a foundational technology are rule-based models, right? And if you look at rule-based models in machine translation, you would have an input string, for example, a source sentence. The model would analyze the source sentence and assign a grammatical category to every individual word in the input string, and then produce a translation based on grammatical rules, right? Did not work very well for certain languages, Asian languages, right to left languages. Sounded a little bit clumsy, but accurate. That's very important, clumsy, but accurate. The second example, statistical models, right? Statistical models based on probability models. Again, mirroring this to machine translation, you would have an input string, and then the model would analyze the input string and try to determine phrases inside the string, then generate a translation based on statistical probability in accordance with similarities or matches for the phrases in the bilingual data, the training data, the corpora underneath the actual statistical model. And then, of course, the third example, neural networks, does not have anything to do with language anymore. It's pure computer science. It's pure data science, consists of interconnected layers of artificial neurons to learn patterns in data and make predictions. And what you need to know about neural networks, they have a lot more use cases than just language translation. Think about text classification, think about sentiment analysis, think about text summarization. And of course, we all know that neural machine translation really accelerated the breakthrough of machine translation in the language services industry and basically forced every localization professional to adapt and adopt the new reality of automated translation. Now, there's one type of neural network, the so-called transformer model, which has turned the language services industry upside down, right? This might get a little bit technical, but I'll try to explain as clearly as possible. Transformer models are based on the concept of self-attention. Like, what is self-attention? If you look at regular or recurrent neural networks, they will process input sequence per sequence, right? And in natural language, a sequence can be a word or even a character. Transformer models, they process input as a whole. They process input as an entity, and this has two big advantages. First of all, transformers are capable of capturing long-range dependencies and relationships between different words in the input sequence. It's more accurate. And it can process more data in a training round, which is also very important and which actually paved the way for the most well-known application of transformer models, the large language models, right? We know that they have been trained on massive amounts of text data, and they achieve human-like performances when they're tasked with content generation. And of course, they are having, or they are causing, a significant breakthrough in the field of natural language processing. So what you need to remember from this is the hierarchy. We have neural networks, and then we have the transformer architecture, which can be applied to neural networks. And then we have one specific application, the large language model, which is turning our industry upside down.
Right. And when we get to looking at how large language models compare with machine translation, let's take one step back and look at how machine translation has been evolving. Because when we say large language models versus machine translation, actually, large language models are pretty good machine translation engines. And machine translation has a very long history. And some of us on this session or viewers later may know this very well. But to recap, it is actually close to 80 years old discipline. The big breakthrough, of course, came in 2006, when, to everybody's delight, Google released Google Translate. And Google Translate back then still used statistical machine translation, similarly to the classification Jourik just mentioned. Statistical was working pretty well, of course, with lots of gaps, and only for a few languages, depending on the training data. And the next big breakthrough, again, came from Google sometime in 2016, which is when neural machine translation was introduced. And ever since then, it has been adopted by essentially all the machine translation providers in the language services and language technology industries. Just 1 year later, in 2017, the transformer model was introduced, and it took up till 2022, as we mentioned previously, when ChatGPT came onto the scene. Which is to say, large language models, or generally language models, have been around for a long time. It was 2022 with ChatGPT when they actually became essentially productized. ChatGPT is just an interface to OpenAI's underlying large language model infrastructures and architectures, but it can be immediately used for machine translation as such. And of course, in 2023, this year already, ChatGPT-4 is actually producing much better results than any previous large language model that we previously knew. And to top that off, of course, we would love to draw a comparison between how, say, GPT models, ChatGPT, whichever version it may be, or GPT-4, how they compare with the current paradigm of neural machine translation. So on the machine translation bench, here's a quick overview of what that may look like. And this is the current state of affairs. And of course, this is liable to change over time as investments into neural machine translation keep happening, as well as large language models may be gaining additional capabilities. What we do observe is that neural machine translation is fairly predictable. It is known and understood by now. It's been around for 6, close to 7 years, whereas large language models are by and large unpredictable. In a sense, they are very experimentative, probably because it's still early days and models are not fine-tuned to the specific purpose of translation. Which is to say, because neural machine translation engines are narrow purpose engines, they are more accurate, but they're less fluent because they focus on segment to segment translation. Whereas large language models, what they do is they have a very general purpose into which machine translation generally does fit. And because they are very fluent in creating languages, they do look very appealing. However, they may be less accurate than the standing paradigm of neural machine translation. Also, because we have lots of experience with NMT, lots, about 6-7 years by now, we probably know all those 90% of cases where we can predict that it will work. And we know the 10% when rather don't even try. Whereas with large language models, such as ChatGPT, it's really hard to tell at this point of time if and when it will work well. Which languages, which content types, which subject matters. And of course, because of uncertainties in large language models and their newness onto the market, it's very easy to overcommit with them. You can easily say, sure, ChatGPT can translate. And there are examples even where institutions have announced that they chose ChatGPT or GPT-4 as a translation engine for their professional translations. But it's really hard to say what the return on investment will be. Whereas with neural machine translation, again, because it's a more established and better understood technology, the ROI is pretty well defined, and it's actually pretty reasonably cheap. Moving on, I think it will be important to address some of the deeper questions around large language models and neural machine translation. Jourik, please take it over from me.
Yeah, thank you, Laszlo. So a very important observation is that large language models have not necessarily been built with translation in mind, right? First of all, they have not been trained exclusively on translation data. They have been trained on language data, not translation data. And they are trained to provide always an answer, even if it doesn't make sense, right? You all know by now that you can easily trick ChatGPT into a wrong answer, right? If it gives you a very accurate answer and you tell it it's wrong, it will apologize and say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. And it will give you another answer, which is not what we're looking for in machine translation, not at all. Nevertheless, and this is also important, large language models, they offer a much broader range of potential applications than regular machine translation systems, translation-first systems ever could. And I have a couple of examples on this slide. First of all, detection and elimination of gender bias, something that regular machine translation systems cannot handle at all. Number 2, different types of QA, including quality estimation, quality scoring, risk prediction even, if you like. Number 3, automated post-editing, rewriting or paraphrasing machine translation output. Terminology, also an asset with the use of a large language model, right? You can ask ChatGPT to give you terminology for a certain domain. You can also give it some text, some input, and ask it to extract terminology from that text. Not just monolingual, not even bilingual, but even multilingual, right? Tested and confirmed by yours truly. Another thing that I find very interesting is transcreation, because we know by now that machine translation is not suitable for transcreation at all. It simply does not work. But I believe that large language models might deserve a bit of research or some experimenting in the field of transcreation for transcreation purposes. Another thing that could be handy is the automated editing of translation memory suggestions. We are seeing some initiatives from TMS providers where fuzzy matches are enhanced, and I believe that large language models could do the exact same thing. So you see use cases galore. And then we can move on. On top of that, and I believe that this is where things really start to get scary, large language models have the ability to learn from context, right? You can give it source text and it will learn from source text. You can give it legacy translations and it will learn from those translations. You can give it style guides and it will memorize the style guides. You can give it glossaries and it will memorize the glossaries. It will take any kind of additional input provided by you into account in the translation process, right? Important detail here, interesting detail here. GPT-4 can memorize roughly 50 pages of context, which is pretty insane, according to me. More intriguingly, large language models are capable of respecting human instructions. Another big difference with regular machine translation systems, right? If you ask ChatGPT to translate a piece of content for a group of children, it will do it. If you ask it to translate the same piece of content for a group of C-suite executives, it will do that as well. If you ask it to translate in the style of Snoop Dogg, it will do that too, right? That is pretty insane. So at this point, we have determined and we know for sure that large language models can be deployed to enrich and to augment the traditional translation process, the traditional machine translation process. But we should ask ourselves a very important question. Will large language models evolve from a tool that can enrich the machine translation process to a core technology for automated translation? I cannot give the answer right now, but I believe that it is very likely. So yes, that might happen. That might happen. No. And I think we can continue with some use cases, right? So we have determined a very important use case, machine translation, and that's being done, right? This is happening. This is a fact. There are so many technology providers who are already providing machine translation supported by GPT-4, GPT-3, and all kinds of large language models. Think about Intento, they're doing that. Think about Custom MT, they are doing that too. And it's very likely that other technology providers will be supporting translations coming from large language models in the coming weeks and the coming months.
Yeah, they just haven't announced it yet, I guess.
Exactly. Like everybody's working on it, and it's very likely that that's going to happen, right? So be prepared. Other potential use cases, source content optimization. You know that source content is not always ready to be translated. You know, we have a very important rule of thumb in the localization industry, which says garbage in, garbage out. You could deploy a large language model to make sure that no garbage goes in. That's perfectly possible, right? Also preparing content for optimal machine translation. That's something else. Another possible use case, engineering, right? You can ask a large language model to write an automation for you, to help you write a script, or to provide technical support. For example, when you are dealing with some kind of error message and you're not able to solve it, ChatGPT might give you a hand, right? That's possible. According to me, ChatGPT and basically any large language model that's trained on the appropriate data is a very good developer. ChatGPT is maybe the best developer and the fastest developer in the world, right? Another one, multilingual content creation. And this is an important one. If you think about it, this is not good news for translation agencies, for language service providers, if people start skipping machine translation or translation in favor of multilingual content creation, right? And when that happens, it will also directly lead to the creation of a new role or a new position within the language services industry, which is the post creator, right? Machine translation created a new role, the post editor. Large language models might create another role, the post creator, in addition to the prompt engineer, of course. Authoring and proofreading, it can do all kinds of authoring and review. You know, it can author documentation for you, technical documentation, style guides, templates, email templates, blog posts, social media posts, you name it. ChatGPT and other large language models could give you a hand. Linguistic context, another one. You know, when a linguist or a PM needs a bit of context for a certain project, what does he or she do? Go to Google, insert a search query, scan the first couple of results, and hopefully find a good answer, right? Now you could actually use a tool like ChatGPT as a turbo-powered Google, insert the search query there, and have an answer on the fly. As a matter of fact, the first TMS integrations doing exactly this are already being released, right? A couple of examples, crowding, localized trados. As Laszlo just mentioned, everybody's looking into it. More support will be released in the near future. That is for sure. Do we have some more use cases? Yes, we should not always think about translation first, right? Think about other disciplines that have a tight connection to the localization industry, such as technical writing, right? You could, for example, ask ChatGPT to convert unstructured data into structured data, DITA, XML, that kind of thing. Think about very specific localization disciplines like audiovisual localization, like preparing content for synthetic voices for text-to-speech. That's something else that could be explored. So really use cases galore. And then again, if you are an adventurous company and if you have identified multiple use cases, you will be able to weave them into one product if you know your way around the API, right? You can really build products on the API. And the truth of the matter is that this comment regarding the APIs actually contains a bit of a paradox because, we determined that large language models have been around for years, but they always stayed under the public radar because of the fact that they have always been API first or API only tools. Now everybody has had a taste of ChatGPT, and all of a sudden people start building products and services on top of the exact same APIs, which is a very interesting observation, according to me.
Right, and I think it's important to highlight that when it comes to deploying large language models or thinking about the use cases in which they actually may provide value and benefit, some of it is client-facing, some of it is internal, and much of it actually will have a very, perhaps profound impact on supply chain of language service providers, or how translators, language talent, or even non-linguistic talent will be used on use cases and workflows where currently translators and linguists would be working. Sure, this already happened kind of with neural machine translation, right? Previously, translators were translators, even though they were translating from scratch or editing translation memory segments. But at the same time, neural machine translation brought about the role of post-editing. Right? Many service providers are still figuring out how to train their linguists to accept machine translation, because it's a very different experience editing raw machine translation output than actual translation memory suggestions. Translation memory suggestions make sense, they just don't fit well if the match is not good enough. Machine translation probably has errors in it that are harder to catch. And this is when multilingual content creation, which is one of the probably key features of large language models that they could do to upset the language industry, brings about different changes than we have previously seen. And Jourik, as you mentioned, yes, if there's no source, because large language models, ChatGPT, can just create content based on a content brief, say a product description or a marketing collateral. There's no source language. If the content is created in multiple languages, then you can no longer compare the English with the German or with the Japanese. And so anybody who goes to edit the actual output will be faced with the problem of, well, I don't know really what to do with it. This is very similar to actually how copy editors work, really. Except copy editors probably face a similar problem, which is the output coming from a large language model as generated and AI generated and AI created content looks, smells, and probably tastes different than a human created output. So copywriting and copy editing will be challenged by what language service providers can do. Actually, multilingual AI content creation gives the opportunity to language service providers to use their multilingual supply chain and provide copy editing services. It's probably not exactly copy editing, just like post editing is not exactly translation, right? And TM editing is not the same as post editing. So there's this new role of post creation or post copy editing. There isn't really a right term for it, probably, but the demand for that will certainly increase as more and more content is created by AI as a draft or the first version, where a human in the loop will still need to validate it, make sure that it's culturally relevant, correct, acceptable, engaging. And it's a good advice to anybody who's working with language talent to train them for this new service, which is there is no source, there's nothing to compare it to, but still it has a purpose, and that purpose needs to be considered when you're rewriting, editing the content that has been created by the AI. No matter how close and how fluent it may sound, the purpose of the content is something that large language models don't inherently understand. Whatever the instruction may be, they may get close to it, but it still takes a human in the loop to make sure that, especially revenue generating or customer engagement and brand experience content, it requires still a human in the loop and that kind of validation. It's an opportunity for the language services industry because it goes upstream into content creation or marketing copy. It's also a bit of a threat because typically language service providers are not currently prepared to provide this kind of service. It's both a challenge and an opportunity. We're curious to find out in our ongoing research how this will be evolving. And then moving on, we would like to talk a little bit about some challenges for the future. And I think the first thing that we need to mention is, well, there's an elephant in the room, right? This question was asked by when machine translation came along with Google Translate. The same question was asked when neural machine translation came onto the scene. Now the question is, will large language models eliminate the language industry? And the very uncontested answer is no, it will not. And the reason why we're very confident to say this is because even though large language service providers, they sell words, or at least they get paid for words and hours, what they really deliver as value to their clients is removing or reducing the complexity of the work being done, essentially providing project management and workflow management to their clients, as well as by using their extensive supply chain in country, native speakers, linguistic talent, or non-linguistic talent equally. And that kind of language and cultural expertise, which is typically managed by vendor management teams at language service provider side, is still a core service that is much appreciated by the buyers, because buyers, and anybody who's on this call or later listening to it, please put your hands up and let us know in the comments or write to us in Nimdzi if you disagree with us. You don't want to micromanage language services. And certainly you don't want to micromanage hundreds of freelancers, depending on the scale of your operations, the number of languages and the scale and volume of content that you handle. This was the paradigm before machine translation. This was the paradigm after machine translation and before large language models, but it has not changed. The value that language service providers create is the same. And for this reason, for enterprise buyers, still language service providers are the go-to, is the go-to place for buying language service. What we're showing on screen.
Yeah, that was my mistake. I think I disappeared for a while because of
connection. Oh, right.
So very, very sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
But anyway, yeah, how to look at it, that's a very good question. First of all, I would encourage everybody within our industry to really embrace the rise of ChatGPT, GPT-4, and large language models in general, because, I mean, we have to be honest, it's here to stay. It's really, it's a game changer. It's a breakthrough in so many ways. It's here to stay. And I think we know that by now, and we just have to embrace the rise, right? Analyze it carefully, play around with it, do your homework, make sure you're on top of things, explore the strengths of large language models, and make sure you know what it can do, and make sure you know what it cannot do, and make sure you're able to work around its weaknesses. So that's very important. Try to define solid use cases for it within your organization, and this really is a joint effort. So this is not something that the tech people are supposed to do. It's not something that the CEO of your company is supposed to do. It's something that really is a thing that everybody within your company can contribute to, right? It's a joint effort because at this point, every idea is a potential use case. So joint effort, that's very important, right? And if possible, become early adopters. If you have some technical knowledge in-house, and if you're able to build something on top of a large language model, then try to become an early adopter. Why not, right? Being the first one has a huge advantage, so that's very important. In general, I advise everybody to think in two directions. First of all, how can I build products or services on top of a large language model? And I know that's a very delicate question, and it's also easier said than done. But my recommendation here would be to make sure that you know more about large language models and ChatGPT than your clients, than your potential buyers, right? Make sure that you write the most perfect prompts. Make sure that you know how to get some tailored output out of a tool like ChatGPT, and make sure you know your way around the API. Very important. And then the second question, a little bit more easy to answer maybe, how can I use a tool like ChatGPT to make my life easier? And I guess a lot of you have been playing around with the tool already and are using it for some good purposes already. I'm really confident. So moving on, some pieces of advice. And I really like this slide because this advice is really good. It's really valid. First of all, talk to your clients, talk about their business needs and pull them in, right? Do experiments with them, do proof of concepts with them, do pilots with them, potentially with disclaimers, but really engage your clients in the conversation, right? But watch out, because it's easy to overcommit and it's easy to underperform, right? Your strategies should be the other way around. You should underpromise and then overdeliver. That's the way to go. Use your talent pool to evaluate results. Yeah, very important. Involve all your stakeholders in the process, like really everybody. Work with your linguists on experiments. Work with them on the evaluation of results. So make them feel they are involved, and they will adapt a lot easier to the adoption of a large language model. And get your supply chain ready, because your supply chain will probably be your greatest asset once you embark on doing something with a large language model, right? A very important remark is the localization industry is known for looking at innovation as disruption, right? We had translation memories and term bases, and they were going to wash away our industry. Did not happen. Then we had machine translation, was going to wash away our industry. Did not happen either. And large language models will not wash away our industry either, right? It's not going to happen. So trust us, right? It's not going to happen, and we have a lot of time to figure it out, so everything will be all right. And this will just be another technological innovation, but not necessarily a disruption. I think that's one of the main takeaways from our recommendations.
Right. And then I think it's important to talk a little bit about how ChatGPT is different from the previous disruptions. May that be neural NT, right? Which again did not bring about the end of language services or translators. If any, it only increased demand for language services and has been fueling the growth of the language services industry in general. Again, showing that our industry is fairly resilient to even very disruptive changes. And we kind of expect very similar from large language models in ChatGPT. The approach from buyer side and the language industry side is very different, of course, also depending on the size of the actors. On buyer side, small, medium businesses, they may have an immediate urgency. They feel like there is some huge gain in large language models, but they would probably have a lack of vision. There's an opportunity there for language service providers to step in and provide some guidance and advice and help small, medium businesses create that vision. And the reverse of that, small, medium business owners, go to your language service providers, because large language models are language-based. They are inherently useful in language services. And if there's a place to go to, it's going to be your language service provider. Larger enterprises, they have a different approach. They would be experimenting, or they are experimenting. They may already have had extensive experience with machine learning, AI in general. However, they still experiment with caution when it comes to large language models. And the key question that they ask is there really return on the investment when it comes to language services, at least? Because mature enterprises with mature language localization programs, they would probably have fairly well-defined metrics as to how to view investments into technology and language services or program and project management. With large language models, it is very not clear. The difference between models can be up to 100-fold in cost, as well as in latency. Response times can be very, very different. The usability of these tools is very, very far from being standard, whereas from machine translation, you expect very similar speed from almost any provider that you would find out there. Governments, of course, will look at this tool with distrust, and there's no doubt about that. At this point of time, what they're thinking about is, how do we mitigate any of the risks coming from large language models, instead of thinking about, hey, yes, we can also use this. Even cloud-based machine translation tools are typically not used in government organizations, let alone a cloud-based large language model, which God really knows what kind of data it was trained on, because it is not being disclosed openly in most of the models, as well as how the output will be used and what kind of what happens with the data that is provided in the prompts. Does it get into the training material? Is it used for any other purposes? This is not clear yet by far, and governments would have the highest level of distrust, of course. On the language industry side, sure, smaller players and startups, they start the gold rush. There's no doubt about that. Basically, everybody is building something. That's the key word. And there's a simple reason for that. If you're reasonably small or new to the market, then your mistakes will be forgotten. However, your success will make you a hero. Established players, again, they experiment with caution, primarily because if there's any big blunder, that may be a lethal blunder. Especially publicly traded language service providers or technology providers, they may be iffy about introducing large-scale changes into their technology stacks. But it is already happening, perhaps in the background, with careful reaching out to clients and figuring out the right use cases, because operational deployment into live environments is a little bit trickier than it sounds at first. These are not plug-and-play tools, for sure. The mid-range players in the language industry, as we hear from our interviews and demo sessions, they kind of face an uncertainty. They don't know yet if it's a friend or foe. Even if they have gotten used to machine translation by now, large language models are a completely new beast in many players' eyes. Some of them welcome it, and some of them are keeping a very, very big distance because of the potential risks that it may bring. However, the key word that we kind of see everywhere is fear of missing out. What everybody's trying to do is to at least play with it. And that's a very important message that we would like to repeat later down in today's session as well. Probably even multiple times. We already said it, right? Something that is different about ChatGPT or large language models is actually machine translation is typically requested by, say, localization programs or perhaps marketing. Maybe product departments on enterprise buyer side. But actually, innovation with large language models is possible and is essentially demanded from any and all areas of businesses, both buyer side and language service provider side. Really, the conversations are changing from, oh, there's this AI thing, maybe it's useful, or, oh, it's very risky, but maybe there's something into it, to there needs to be an AI strategy into which every department can feed their demand into. What is the AI strategy for our organization? That's what enterprises ask, and that's also how language service providers approach the question, hopefully by now. And last but not least, of course, it's not all cheery pink future, right? There are plenty of threats, nevertheless. We do recommend that you play with these models, but there are a few things to bear in mind. Number one, of course, is any concerns around security and data privacy. There is no doubt that many of the issues, and there are plenty of them, but we'll not go into detail because that would be a very long conversation. And say the US Congress also just started the hearings and testimonials on these generative AI models, still trying to figure out what to do with it. But the truth is that there are plenty of concerns that hopefully will be solved along the way somehow. Of course, if these models could be implemented on-premise easily and cheap, this would not be a major concern. It is far from being so. Also, if you're thinking about building a product, also think about the fact, as Jourik already mentioned, it's actually quite easy to get started with large language models and building products with them through APIs. The barrier to entry is very low. Other industries, whether it be software development or from marketing agencies, they may consider to do exactly the same that you have in mind. Product market fit is really important, and getting alignment from your clients or your prospects in your niche or vertical is critical to be able to pull off successful deployments. And then again, there's the risk of, if you're a language service provider, your buyers can do this in-house themselves. if they have an AI strategy and they have budget, well, it's kind of tough right now to find budget and people for investments nowadays. But they can do this on their own with a few capable Python engineers. Unless, and this is one of the key concerns, also an article released not so lately, of course, even in Fortune 500, adoption of large language models is slow to a certain degree, and not just because of the risks, but also because it looks like large language models are kind of at the end of a digital transformation path, and many companies are not even close to getting there. They have challenges even with their data architecture, let alone with being able to use those data for fine-tuning and training their own language models. But for very specific use cases, when it comes to content creation, rephrasing, summarization, large language models have a lot of potential that buyers also can implement in-house for $20 a month, if I'm correct with the price.
Yeah, something like that.
And another thing that comes to mind is large language models will redefine what good enough is. In general, a new quality framework is probably in order, if possible, to create at all for large language models. It took years for the industry to create different metrics for machine translation, quality metrics, and to understand how well different engines perform, in what language pairs, what kind of content. And we're getting there on neural machine translation for sure. There have been several iterations. It took a long time to discuss how to even understand language quality and what's important. When it comes to large language models, because they can speak so many languages and create content without source, the question of quality and good enough quality will need a new definition, which will probably be more content consumer or customer facing than language quality based. And last but not least, we have to mention, sure, there was a lot of hype around ChatGPT. Large language models are still somewhere high in the hype curve, maybe already past the peak, which, of course, according to Gartner at least, means the trough of disillusionment is coming. And the question is, how big is it? How deep is it? And how wide? Will it take 6 months to climb out of it based on regulations concerns or privacy or on-premise, model size questions, latency problems? Or will it be 3, 4, 5 years until these get actually figured out so that large enterprises can safely invest into actual implementations and in live environments? And then with that said, I think, Jourik, would you have any final comments as a wrap up?
I do have one final comment. It's about the offer of large language models. So right now, in the whole context of AI, we spontaneously think and talk about OpenAI and ChatGPT. But the truth of the matter is that we actually already have an entire catalog of different large language models coming from different providers, including some very big players like Google and Amazon, right? So it's very likely that in the coming weeks, the coming months, we will have more solutions being released, right? Being to a very wide audience, and they will become very accessible, just like happened to machine translation. So it's very likely that large language models will follow the same journey as machine translation solutions. Yeah, definitely.
I think that's very well noted. And I guess also in machine translation, there has been a proliferation of different options, right? Which even called for the MT sommelier role to be able to advise as to what to use and where. But something that I would probably like to add is that, MT is probably harder to implement than large language models in the simplest fashion, which kind of means, sure, to install AI or to fine-tune a large language model, you do require some expertise. But to start playing around with them, you actually only need an open mindset. To be hands-on with it and just start using it, figure out how it benefits you, and also, of course, to identify some risks. Bearing in mind, you just mentioned that probably many more models are coming out, already have come out, of course, even from the open source community. One of the problems there is the ground is shifting so fast, you can't really make big investments right now, because maybe in 1, 2, 3 months' time, there will be some architectural change or some new miracle, a new inflection point in the technology, which will just evaporate all your ROI expectations. And of course, all the regulatory problems EU is coming with this AI Act for sure. We don't know what it's going to exactly look like, but the US is doing very similar. Nevertheless, what we absolutely recommend, and again for the umpteenth time probably, the key takeaway from this session, ladies and gentlemen, is run your small pilots, your proof of concept, experiment, test, get your hands on it. And empirical usage and comparison of results is the best way you can get involved. Yeah, if you're thinking about big investments, it may be tough to get actually buy-in from your top managers, but through experimenting, you may actually get some understanding of how these models may be able to help you in the future when a little bit the dust settles, if it ever does. With that said, I was almost going into the outro script, but Tucker, if you're still online with us, of course you are. Thank you for being with us and helping us organizing and doing the tech in the background. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I saw the comments running all the time, but I'm sure there are also questions that maybe we can quickly answer with Jourik, seeing that we have a few more minutes.
Yeah, a couple questions here. So thank you very much for everybody, for Laszlo, Jourik, for the great informative presentation. A couple questions here that I saw. First is from Catherine Allen. It seems like you are predicting a need for talented monolingual writers to edit multilingual content creation. So a threat for long-term incentive for talented bilingual workers to develop their language skills to a high level. I'm curious how you see where the focus for educating translators and other bilingual linguists will head. So where is the focus for translator education heading? Do you see this as affecting the way that we train and develop translators and interpreters?
Well,
I guess it could extend that too.
On the short term, Jourik, I think you agree with me. The short-term neural machine translation is still neural machine translation. It's cheap, it's effective, it's easily deployable because it's understood well. This will stay to be so, right? Which means translators will keep doing what they do, post-edit or edit TMHs or whatever it may be, maybe to a larger extent than before. What large language models bring about is, yes, some of that work, especially what I would prefer calling content that is not business critical, or rather has a pretty wide tolerance for error, right? Those kind of contents, they can be created easily in ChatGPT in multi-languages. But still, the cultural match and the brand image match is the one that it will be really important when these contents are created and published. And so one of the things that the translators may need to do additionally to the work that they do currently is to gain an understanding of how marketing actually works, right? How do you know if the content becomes effective? How does it become attractive? How does it engage the reader or the viewer or the listener, whatever it may be? And that kind of cultural match and brand awareness and brand experience will be part of the driver, which currently translators, when they translate even marketing content, is typically underrated. But this is something that translators or language talent need to be demanding.
Yeah.
Who is the audience? Who is this for? What do you expect this content to be able to do? Yeah. Those are questions that the translation industry typically doesn't care much about because sometimes it's observed as a utility for certain types of content. But yes, for marketing content, certainly. It's important that the kind of brand awareness exercises are observed. And then if language learning can be trained up in this respect, that would be really helpful for language service providers. That's my opinion.
And can I jump in?
Please.
Sorry, you knew if you let me come on screen, I was going to take over the conversation.
Yeah.
But I lecture and teach at a couple universities, and so I see firsthand how the translation programs are a little bit behind the scenes on that. And one thing I know that always has been and always will be a struggle for translator training is this. Is keeping up with technology, because technology moves at such an incredible pace and academia does not. Academia moves at a pretty slow pace. And I mean, if you think about it, if I was a teacher and I was teaching, training translators, the future translators, and putting together my spring semester curriculum back in January, even if I wanted to include ChatGPT and large language models and all of that into my curriculum, so much has changed just since January.
Well, you would be hard put to do that future proof, for
Right,
sure.
exactly. So it's always going to be a challenge. How I see it happening is a change in the shift that translators learn, a more of a focus on continuous education, not just in linguistic abilities, but in technology. I think the most successful translators of the future are going to be the ones that embrace the technology and understand how to use it.
I think on the short term, when thinking about education for linguists, we will look at things that are defined now for post editors, right? So whether post editors required to do or required to know, they need to know a thing or two about machine translation technology. They need to know the kind of errors that machine translation engines can produce, and they need to know that they're not supposed to over-edit machine translation output. They're not supposed to under-edit machine translation output. And again, on the short term, only on the short term, I think that education for linguists who will be working with large language models will look a lot like the things that we're seeing in education around post-editing. But that's my humble opinion at this moment.
Thank you, Jourik. Let's go to Kedar Desai asks, can ChatGPT translate medical document text from, say, Gujarati into Swahili with precise cultural accuracy?
Oh, so
And I don't know if this is like a sarcastic question, like, oh, can you do that? I don't think so. But gentlemen, have at it.
Until the last three words with the whatever it was, the
Precise cultural
cultural
accuracy.
accuracy.
Three
If
very
you skip
loaded
those
words.
three, the answer is absolutely yes.
Right. Up until the last three words, you had us. You had us.
Yes.
Well, I have an anecdote. My wife is from Bolivia, and just the other day I wrote her a love letter in Quechua, which is her mother tongue, and I asked ChatGPT to write that letter for me, and she was like, "What the hell is this? I don't understand the word." So,
Yeah.
I don't know. But then again, she was like, "Yeah, maybe this is Quechua for people in Ecuador. I don't know." But that was the deal. So she wasn't convinced, unfortunately.
There's this hypothesis, forecast, whatever, going around, created by someone smarter than me right now, that machine translation, because what we're talking about here is machine translation mostly, and machine translation's really hitting the point where the ROI of future investment into improving machine translation is not there, right? So it's kind of reached its saturation point. And where it does have room to advance is in these languages of lesser diffusion, like what you mentioned, Gujarati and Swahili.
Your resource languages, yeah.
Yeah. The problem is, what is the ROI? Because it doesn't make sense for Google to invest into developing that machine translation. So
it makes sense for Microsoft,
right? Well, I mean, it outside of just like a corporate social responsibility perspective, right? So we're going to see more and more of the R&D shift from the tech companies into the area of academia and be funded by things like grants rather than ROI on products. But yeah, good question. Thank you very much. We got another one from Catherine Allen. A second question: what do you think will be the most immediate application of this technology for interpreting? Oh, and folks, I know we scheduled this for an hour. If you have to run, thank you very much for joining, but we're going to keep going. Just got a couple more questions. A second question: what do you think will be the most immediate application of this technology for interpreting? For example, we are already seeing fully generated AI simultaneous interpreting services being sold on the market.
Well, typically machine translation is plugged into those. And for example, if it's simultaneous interpretation, then for example, the latency of the current large language models is kind of prohibitive in that case. But yeah, I mean,
for now,
what they could do is anything that is language related. Would it be pulling out terminology or identifying whatever key labeled items in speeches, or help with creating a custom search. So whatever Bing is doing or Google Bard is actually very helpful being connected to the internet. It can actually summarize you various documents and help you with guiding you in your interpretation. I'm not an interpretation expert, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But as far as I know the market, and I know from Nimdzi and our experts, the likely answer is, and I can't speak in their name specifically, but the likely answer would be they're probably a little bit less relevant for interpretation than they are for translation and localization.
I have been thinking about one use case. I mean, if you have text and you want to give it to a text-to-speech engine, you have to write it in a specific syntax, which is called SSML. And in SSML, you really indicate where you want to take a break, and whenever you want to pronounce something in English or in another language, or whether you want to pronounce an acronym, yes or no. And I was actually thinking, and this is on my mind really, that you can actually use a large language model to take plain text and convert that into SSML and ask it to prepare it properly for text-to-speech. So that's something I have been thinking about, and that might be a good use case.
It's kind of, it's still the source optimization question.
In a way, yes. Yeah.
I would say I see two potential things that could happen here. One of them positive, one of them negative, right? And the positive one would be kind of what we saw with machine translation is, rather than machine translation destroying our jobs and taking away the translators' jobs and replacing everybody, what we saw was companies were able to translate content, lots of content that previously there was no ROI. It wouldn't have made sense.
Absolutely.
to, right? So
Absolutely.
what we'll see with machine interpreting is more events will offer machine interpreting to attendees. For example, just using event interpretation as an example, where previously it wouldn't have made sense financially and no interpreting would have been provided. So it's better than nothing, and I see that as a positive development.
With tolerable error levels.
Tolerable error levels, right? Now, a negative potential development that I could see is interpreting for healthcare, for example, is regulated and is mandated by a lot of governments. So if I go into hospital here in the US and I need an interpreter, I'm entitled to an interpreter for my language. Right. It is my right as an American citizen, not even as an American citizen, it is my right as someone residing in America to have access to interpreting. So these healthcare organizations, healthcare systems, hospitals are required by law to have interpretation services provided. Now, they're required to have interpretation. They're not required to have good interpretation, if you get where I'm going with this, right? So I could see it as an excuse, essentially, for people, organizations that previously are required to have quality interpretation for their clients, customers, patients, to be able to save a few bucks and not offer the best interpretation. So that's where I would say with that.
Well, it's still AI powered, right? Even NMT is AI powered. Actually, NMT architectures are not that far from transformers in the first place. But yeah, ChatGPT will not do interpretation yet.
Yep. Yeah. Everything in this presentation today is to be caveated with the word yet.
Exactly. So voice-to-voice modality may be coming soon.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Well, I think that's it for our questions. The last question here is not so much a question, but a demand. It says, we want this PowerPoint. And here's what we typically do after these events is we will post this as a PDF onto our LinkedIn page where you can go and download it. If you'd like more information from us, once again, info@nimdzi.com is the way that you reach out to us. And if there's no other question, one more question. Catherine Rosen, coming in at the last minute here. Do you envision IoT devices, Internet of Things devices in medical being the hub where AI performance will add value, perhaps?
Oh, that's probably a long way off in the future.
Yeah. I mean, yet, right?
Okay, 1 year ago we would have said that where we are now is a long way off in the future. So I take that back.
Yeah, from a language perspective, I mean, we already have devices in medical settings that are being used for interpretation, but right now they're being used for what's it called? VRI, video remote interpretation, and all it takes is a firmware update or a software update pushed to those devices to start using more AI generated services. If we're talking about languages, if we're talking about actual medical diagnoses, well, AI is already being used in the medical field, but of course that's outside of our area of expertise on this call. So, ladies, gentlemen, Laszlo, Jourik, thank you very much. Do you mind
No,
if
no, we would like to thank everybody for joining us today. And if you're live watching, thanks very much, and the participation in the comments. I will go through them in LinkedIn anyway later. And for the questions, and anybody who's watching in the future, hello to my future self.
Jourik?
Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, guys, I will just do the honors of taking us out today here. So as we are finishing up, if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to Nimdzi Insight. Check out our LinkedIn page, YouTube, the channel, all of that stuff. You'll be the first person to be notified when we publish new research relevant to this and many, many other topics that are relevant to global enterprises. If you haven't already subscribed to or if you haven't already done so, make sure to check out our future events. We've got a couple of events here. Just let me get all these windows out of the way. A couple events here that you should go sign up for right now. In addition to that, we also have a bunch of podcasts hosted by yours truly on Nimdzi Live, on the Nimdzi Live platform. And so if you like podcasts and if you like language services, then subscribe to Nimdzi Live on your podcast platform of choice. Lastly, if you'd like any more information about case studies, we've got a ton of case studies. If you're interested in how other organizations do things in this industry or how Nimdzi has helped people at organizations, both on the client side and the vendor side, overcome their challenges, go to nimdzi.com/testimonials for more information. Our Lessons in Localization research series is also a very good resource for you. A couple featured case studies for today. We have Language Technology Roadmap Assessment, which was Schneider Electric, and we have a case study called Localization Program Audit and Supply Chain Government Deployment. And that is a mouthful. If you want to understand what that is, go to nimdzi.com/testimonials. Lastly, if you want to continue your learning, we have a number of asynchronous e-learnings available at nimdzi.com/courses, I believe, is where you find that. You can find it from nimdzi.com. And we also schedule lots of in-person workshops or virtual workshops with our members, with our Nimdzi partners. So with that, you can use these resources to discover how global organizations have successfully assessed and improved the maturity of their localization programs over time. Get inspired how you can do the same. Once again, my name is Tucker Johnson, and a big thank you to Laszlo Varga and Jourik Ciesielski. Jourik, sorry, I can't do last names. To Laszlo and Jourik. It has been our pleasure to host you today, and we will look forward to seeing you next time. Cheers.